Hello, bio students, and those of you in Carmen's class that subscribe to my YouTube lessons. This presentation is going to be on, well, as it says here, brain scanning technologies. So we have already chatted a little bit about the brain structures and just a quick little bit of a review here. This picture is nicely showing us in different colors the major parts of the brain anyway. So we can see right behind your forehead here, up above your eyes, that is the frontal lobe that we have. In behind the frontal lobe, in this picture here, it's kind of shaded in yellow. That one is the parietal lobe. Right at the back of your brain, shown in blue here, this is the occipital lobe. Green along the sides where your ears are is the temporal lobe. And we see one other kind of important structure here, this one that sits down below the occipital lobe, and that one is the cerebellum. So in terms of the cerebrum, it's made up of the four different lobes, the frontal, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobe. And just to very, very quickly refresh your memory on the major functions: frontal lobe, executive functions; motor control, voluntary motor control; personality; parietal lobe, sensory perception, somatosensory from your skin, taste; occipital lobe, vision; temporal lobe, hearing, memory; cerebellum, balance, posture, and coordination. So what are brain scanning technologies? Well, what they're going to provide information on is what parts of the brain are actually responsible for processing different information or initiating certain kinds of activities. So how do we know, for example, that the frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary motor control and the occipital lobe is responsible for vision? It doesn't really go back that far. So prior to the 20th century, very little was known about the function of different parts of the brain, unless there was some sort of an accident. Someone had a brain injury, and from that injury, they could kind of infer what part of the brain might be responsible for different activities. So interesting story here, someone by the name of Phineas Gage, a railway worker, and what he was responsible for was for packing the explosives that they used when they were building railways. And for packing the explosives, what they used is what is called a tamping iron. And we can see this is the tamping iron that we have here. And based upon the size of the skull, it looks like this is probably about 2 meters in length. Well, in the case of poor Phineas Gage, he was packing down the explosives when the explosives went off, and this tamping iron was driven right through his face on the left side and through the top of his skull. As we can see in the picture here, this is his skull after he died, and we can see the hole. But you know what? He didn't die right away. He actually lived. Not only did he live, he was conscious the entire time. The tamping iron went through his skull. He was taken to the doctor. Not really too much the doctors could do at the time. And in fact, for something like this, probably still not too much that they could do today. He did survive, and he lived, but he wasn't quite the same. So what was different, and how could they use that information to figure out what the frontal lobe is responsible for? Well, he was kind of a different person in terms of his personality. So if we read through at least the first little bit here, the damage to Gage's frontal cortex had resulted in complete loss of social inhibitions, which often led to inappropriate behavior. He had a change in personality, a complete change in personality. Pretty much everything else was intact. It was fine. His hearing was fine. His visual system was fine. His motor control was fine. Sensory perception, it was all fine, but his personality had changed. So frontal lobe, if that was in fact what was damaged, it certainly looked like that from the injury in the skull. So frontal lobe having something to do with personality. So jump ahead a little bit. In the 1920s, surgeons started to do open brain surgery. And this is kind of interesting because these patients, they can be awake during this process when they are doing brain surgery. There are no pain receptors in the brain, so they can poke away at the brain tissue itself and no pain is felt. Kind of like going to the dentist, all you need is a local anesthetic. Local anesthetic at the dentist freezes your mouth area, but you're still awake, you're still conscious. All they need to do is freeze that area around your scalp, cut through the skin and tissue and through the skull as well, and they can remove the skull cap. And what we see here is, yes, they are looking onto the surface of the brain, the cerebral cortex. Remember that nervous system tissue, it is electrochemical in nature, which means if you give it electrical stimulation, then those neurons will generate an action potential and they will send a message. So this is exactly what they did. They weren't in there for no reason whatsoever. There would have been something wrong with the person, and that's why they're exposing their brain. Maybe they have a tumor, a cancerous tumor that needs to be removed. Maybe they are an epileptic and they're having seizures and they're doing something with the brain in order to alleviate the symptoms associated with that. But while you're in there, what the heck? Why not stimulate the brain and see what they find? So what did they find? Well, you take an electrode and you stimulate the occipital lobe of the brain, and what happens? Well, the person sees something. You stimulate the temporal lobe and it elicits a memory or some sort of a sound. You stimulate the right side of the frontal lobe, right at the back in the primary motor area, and it results in movement on the left side of the body. You stimulate the left parietal lobe in the primary somatosensory area, and someone feels some sort of a sensation on the right side of their body. So then they started to piece this all together. Right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Information coming from the eyes goes to the occipital lobe, and so on and so on. So now we know the basic functions of the major parts of the brain. So what other cool technologies do we have? Some of these do go back decades. They're not necessarily brand new technologies. This one here, electroencephalogram, abbreviated EEG. This one here, what they do is they're not stimulating the brain, but they're measuring the natural electrical activity right underneath the surface of the skull. So what they have is something that looks like, well, a shower cap or a swimming cap, only it has a whole bunch of electrodes scattered all over it. They put this on top of their head and it picks up electrical signals, not through the entire brain, but just underneath the scalp. So it's really just useful in measuring the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex. So they can measure what is going on just underneath the scalp by taking a look at the electrical activity. And this one is very, very quick in terms of producing a result. The results that it does give is a wave-like pattern. My picture seems to have shown up on here, but what it shows is a graph that shows a pattern, a bunch of wiggly lines that, well, maybe looks like this. Or maybe they get wiggly lines that kind of look like this for different things. So this one here might be, or both of these perhaps, might be when the person is sleeping. This might be a pattern that you see if the person is under deep sleep. This one here might be more of a shallow sleep. Deep sleep, sometimes referred to as REM sleep for rapid eye movement. When they're awake, it might be a completely different pattern. Maybe we see a pattern that kind of looks like this if the person is awake. So by taking a look at these patterns, comparing a normal person to someone that maybe has a brain injury, then you can maybe diagnose if there is an injury to the brain, and in particular this cerebral cortex. So useful for, yes, diagnosing an injury, if someone has had a stroke or if they've had a fall, if they've been in an automobile accident. And it's taking a look at the brain activity, at the function. Is the brain functioning in certain regions as it would in a normal person? I mentioned sleep, so for diagnosing sleep disorders, epilepsy, they can generate what is called a map, a colored map of the brain showing the electrical activity while performing different activities, and that's referred to as brain electrical activity mapping. And very, very important, if someone is determined to be brain dead, This is the way that they determine it. What do you see in the graph if someone is brain dead? Well, this is what you see. No more wave-like fashion that we see in the cerebral cortex. That doesn't mean there's nothing going on in the brain, but in terms of the higher functioning levels, the cerebral cortex, there is nothing going on there. Other technologies, this one here doesn't take a look at the functioning of the brain, but it takes a look at the structure itself. The physical structure, is there physical damage to the brain? This one here does use x-rays. X-rays, as you probably know, they can be harmful, and that's why you want to sort of minimize your exposure to x-rays. So they are used to generate this picture. X-rays, of course, typically only work with hard things like bones and teeth. So how does it work with soft tissue like the brain? Well, they do have to inject something into the person, something called the contrast medium, and that just allows the soft tissue to become somewhat visible. Still not quite as good as with bones or teeth, but at least you get some sort of an image, and that some sort of an image, yeah, it isn't great. It's what we call low resolution, so it's kind of a grainy picture, but what's kind of cool is it gives these sort of thin sliced images, so we can see the picture of the brain here going from the top down, and it's as if you were able to take the brain out and slice it into these sections that are maybe 0.5 centimeters or 5 millimeters in thickness, and you're able to take a look at each one of these layers to see if there is any physical damage. So what is it useful for? Well, again, if someone has a tumor, if they were in an accident and they have trauma, injury to the brain, or if they've had a stroke, an interruption in the blood flow to the brain. Interruption in blood flow means no oxygen, no glucose. That region of the brain is going to die, and that's the sort of thing that would show up as physical damage when you're doing a CT scan or the computer tomography. So these are actual images taken through the various different layers. So the one at the upper left-hand side is toward the bottom of the brain. Then eventually we go up through the middle section of the brain, and we end up at the lower right-hand side, the very top portion of the cerebral cortex. This one here also shows structural damage. So in that sense, it's similar to the previous one, the CT scan. This one here, instead of x-rays, the person is slid into this tube here, which has a very, very strong magnetic field, radio waves that influence water, protons in the water, they emit radio waves, and a computer scanner on the outside is what's going to pick up this information, and it will develop an image, it'll develop a picture of the soft tissue. So this one here, again, similar to the CT scan in the sense that it gives very, very thin slices of the brain from various different angles. It doesn't have to be from top to bottom. It can be from side to side, or it can be from front to back. This one nicer because there are no x-rays. There's no radiation. You don't have to inject them with anything. It's non-invasive, and it gives a better picture. So why not just do this one? Well, this is the reason. More expensive, much more expensive, the equipment that we're talking about and the technology and the technicians in order to use this equipment compared to an x-ray. But once again, it is showing physical damage that is taking place in the brain. So if we take a look at a couple of pictures here, it's showing us physical damage using both a CT scan. So what we can see is this area here is what they're sort of pointing out. That's a little bit different, but it's not a great picture with a CT scan. So if it looks like there's physical damage, let's spend a little bit more money, do an MRI, and then it becomes very, very clear that yes, there is some structural damage, and that might be an explanation for the loss of activity that someone might be experiencing and the change in brain function. Next one here, PET, positron emission tomography. Here the person is injected with something. What they're injected with, it can be various different things. It can simply be oxygen that all of your cells require, glucose. It can be a drug that they might be testing, whether it's a legal drug or an illegal drug that they're testing. But what they do is they give it what's called a radioactive tag or a radioactive label. And when this circulates through the person, they can actually track where it is going, because what they do is they emit gamma rays, which can be detected on the outside of the body, and it's going to develop an image pinpointing where that different compound is going. This one here takes a little bit longer, so it's not quick like the EEG. It does take several seconds, but it gives us a really cool color contrast picture showing the activity of the brain while performing different activities. Kind of comparable, I guess, to the CT scan in the sense that, it doesn't give a best picture, but it does give an indication if there are major regions in the brain that are not functioning as they normally would. So in this picture here, the red shows high color, the blue shows low color, and the green and the yellow are somewhere in the middle. So for this one here, it's taking a look at a normal patient and someone that might have Alzheimer's disease, so impaired brain function. We can see a big difference in terms of the functioning in different parts of the brain. So in this case here, they may have injected the person with radioactive glucose or oxygen, and we can see that it's just not going to these regions of the brain in someone that has Alzheimer's disease, and those regions of the brain are simply not functioning or not functioning to their full potential. This is probably the most used one now, and the most powerful and important one, it seems, right now, functional magnetic resonance imaging. This one here still uses the MRI machine, but now what they're taking a look at is the measurement of blood flow. So they do take a look at the comparison between oxygen and deoxygenated hemoglobin. If it is more deoxygenated, what that means is that part of the brain is being used. It's consuming energy, and in order to consume that energy and use that energy, you need more oxygen, hence the blood becomes deoxygenated. And so indirectly you're kind of measuring the blood flow. So this one here, again, kind of similar or more similar to the MRI, comparing it to the CT scan, we get a higher resolution image of the brain. So comparable to the PET, only this one, well, is going to be a little bit better. So it is used to determine specific brain regions and what their activity is that is associated with performing different functions. So just a couple of pictures here, and what we talk about is the area of the brain that lights up. So for speech, we can see these areas that are lighting up. Remember, the language center of the brain is on the left. So this would what we would normally see if someone is talking. The left side of the brain is what is going to be generating that speech, and those areas are going to light up when we're performing the functional MRI. If someone is tapping their finger, we would have a different region that would light up. So this would be somewhere in the frontal lobe, the primary motor area in the frontal lobe. And if this is showing the left side of the brain, and if this one is also the left side of the brain, the finger that would be tapping would then be on the right side of the body. And for listening, in this case, the listening would probably be listening to speech, because again, it is the left side of the brain that is lighting up here. And that is the part of the brain, the left side of the brain, that's responsible for processing language-related information. Last one that I have here, magnetoencephalography, or MEG. Whenever you have an electrical current, it doesn't matter if it's a copper wire or if it is what's going on in the brain with the neurons and the electrical activity, you do have a magnetic field that is generated as well. It is a weak magnetic field, but it is generated and it can be detected using this technology. So in some ways, this would be better than the electroencephalogram because it's even faster. We're talking about a millisecond range and a pretty good resolution, 2 millimeter resolution in terms of what part of the brain is more active while perhaps performing different activities. So it can precisely locate areas of cortex whose activity changes when the person is performing a particular task.